You've been gone for 2 weeks, so the place is a mess. You do the housework, the washing, you cook the meals. That's Alice. You look after her. Homework, bath, all that crap. Got it?
Right away, Todd. Aren't you going to school today? I'm sure we used to be friends before I was reset. Maybe we can be friends again.
You shouldn't mess around with my stuff. It makes me nervous.
I'm sorry, Todd.
What are you looking at? Maybe you think this is easy. Maybe you think it's my fault your fucking mother took off. Fucking whore walked out on me for a fucking accountant! Come back here. You stay there. Don't you dare fucking move. Alice! Daddy's very mad! It's all over now. Daddy isn't angry anymore. You know Daddy loves you. This is all your fault!
He's coming! He's gonna hurt me! Run! Get away, or he's gonna break you like last time!
You're coming with me. That's enough! I want you to leave Alice alone.
She's mine. I do what I want with her!
Kara!
Come back here!
Watch out, Kara!
PlayStation.
Hi, my name is Philip Sheppard and I'm a composer and a producer, and I'm here at Spitfire HQ to talk about the work that I did on a game made by Quantic Dream for PlayStation called Detroit Become Human. So that trailer premiered at the Paris Game Week and it caused a real controversy because obviously it's showing moments of great peril and perceived violence towards children, and there's all sorts of things that it opened up. The tabloid newspapers in England started running a campaign against the game before they actually knew very much about it. Whilst we were in the post-production phase, there was all this sort of maelstrom going on about the perceived nature of the game. And I was really tempted to actually kind of engage with it and say, no, you don't understand at all. This game actually is strongly sort of feminist. It's actually humanist. The whole point is against violence. The whole point is actually about protecting a child the entire way through the game. It's not what you think. And I thought it'd be good to actually talk about the sort of responsibility of writing music for a project that becomes serious and has this baggage, even though it's supposed to be a form of entertainment. But also I thought it'd be useful to maybe talk about the differences between writing for film and writing for non-linear narrative, writing for this particular kind of game. There's obviously a movement in game towards them being less locked into a timeline that kind of goes from left to right. And I come from a background of writing music for movies for the last 10 or 11 years, where obviously you're locked into a process where it's never going to change however you watch the film. In a game, that's just not the case. So there's a whole discipline in how you prepare your methodology for composing to this kind of picture. And just to give you some idea of the difference in the content, with a normal movie project, you can expect a script to maybe be 130 pages long. With this particular game, when I asked to read the script, it was 2,500 pages long. It's a completely different concern. It's a very different discipline. And so writing for it is an entirely different kettle of fish. So I thought what might be useful is for me to talk about actually how we came up with the theme for this character, Kara. And just to give you some context, the commission for this game was highly unusual. I got a message on LinkedIn, of all things, saying, would you be interested in writing music for a game? And rang them back and, well, tell me about it. They played me a trailer which had been made in advance, which was already using a track of mine that I'd written for Audio Network. And I realised that this is a completely different sort of way of presenting entertainment. The production value is incredibly high, the graphics are extraordinary, and it was clear that the people's editing were very, very competent, and it was making my music sound far better than it is. So I was very interested at that point. But then the pitch became quite strange because there were three lead characters within the game. There's a character called Marcus, a character called Connor, and a character called Kara. They are each of them androids, and they gain a sense of sentience and responsibility. But my role was to write music for just one of the characters. Thinking about it, I've never really had a context where I've had to write music for a single element of a project. Because if you're writing music, say, for a drama, you're writing for probably each of the characters and their interactions. You're also writing, to some extent, the soundscape and the landscape, the contextual musical frame as well for everything too, as well as all sorts of other types of cues, maybe they're to do with peril or stress or action or melancholy. However, in this game, my brief was very much to write from within the character's own mindset and her view out. Purely that. So I'm not dealing with interaction with any of the other characters, really. I'm not really necessarily dealing with where those characters are either. This is a completely different discipline, and the only parallel I could come up with, really, was imagine writing an opera where you get to represent one of the single characters alone. Just one character. That could be a recipe for disaster. However, the other composers on this project, luckily, were highly accomplished. So there's John Paisano and there's Nima Fakuri. And the two of them and myself realised that we all had very different sound worlds. John has this big, epic, hybrid sort of sound that he does, and you'll hear it in things like the Maze Runner scores that he's done. And then Nima has got this wonderful sort of found sound of analog synth mixed with creating his own instruments, this sort of up-close, gritty, beautiful sort of almost like sort of analog synth chamber music, I'd say, to do with and found sounds. Mine tends to be sort of melancholy strings. That's really what I do, so I'm down with that. And our layers are sort of quite different in that respect. So there wasn't really necessarily a problem with being on each other's toes, but we became quite insular in the way that we were writing our own characters for very obvious reasons, as I'll show you. But what I'd like to show you first is actually how I came up with the theme for Kara herself. Now, Kara is an android. She's a robot. So I knew in my head this was going to be clockwork, this was going to be mashed up speak and spell, this was going to be sort of, little circuitries, this was going to be electronica and loops and clockwork and stuff like that. And I couldn't have been more wrong. So I'm just going to play the beginning bit of the trailer, and I'll just show you how the theme actually came about in a very different way from how I thought it was going to come about. So here's the beginning of the trailer. So it's just a two-note theme, really, with a little back answer to it. And it's got a kind of Victorian simplicity to it in the piano part as well. It's not doing a huge amount. But it's open enough that harmony underneath can move around as well. And when I write, I tend to write by looping cello. I can't play the piano. Well, I can, but it's terrible. So I will use the cello and loop pedals to stack up these layers. And in fact, what you're hearing in the demo is actually, sorry, in the trailer here, is actually my demo music, which stayed in all the way through the process until we got into Abbey Road with a full orchestra. But the cello actually stayed in there as this kind of fragile line. Now, it's just a two-note theme. It's just a da-dum, da-da-dum. That's it. I based it on the character's name, Kara. But the critical part of it, actually, was the internal riff that built out of that, this sort of implied harmony. When I'm writing music, I don't tend to necessarily write to a picture. And in fact, with a game, the level of detail in the character's expressions really doesn't come in until very much the 11th hour. And the lead times on a game are extraordinarily long compared to a movie. Some of the films I've worked on, it's been 3 weeks from commission, and within that 3 weeks, you have to write the music, score it up, record it, mix it, and deliver it. This was nearer to a year. That sounds like a luxury, but actually the problem with that is you end up with a luxury of too much choice. Not just for yourself, but also sometimes for the team that you're working with as well. I wrote a theme for Kara that I thought, after lots of thought, I thought this is the right tune. And I'd written after traveling for a while, and I remember sitting in this lodge that I sometimes rent in Montana, the middle of nowhere. Phone doesn't work, that's the best thing about it. There's snow piled up to the window kind of level. There's a fire burning in the grate. Sounds very romantic, but I was sitting there basically, I need to get this theme written. I just had to have an idea, and I could see the flames flickering. That became a pattern that comes actually into the game. And then I thought, well, actually, I'll just use her name and play that, and suddenly it just popped fully formed. I wrote the theme, recorded it, sent it off, and the director, David Cage, he said, okay, thank you. I'd like you to write something else. Okay, I'll write another one. So I wrote another one and sent it to him. Like, it's not quite there. And sent me the script again. I was like, I've memorized this script. We got to the 7th version of the theme. And I know every composer has this, where you the more you write, the more sort of desperation sort of creeps in, and you think, I'm overthinking it now. And the production team were all based in Paris for the studio. And it got to the point when I thought I really probably need to present my 8th version of this in person, because if this doesn't work, I'm probably going to get fired. Nothing to lose, booked the flight, flew to Paris. Right, I'm going to play you my 8th version of Kara's theme, and we're going to listen to it together. So I sat there with the music team and the director, and we listened to it. I said, but we're going to listen to it 3 times, because this has taken a long time to write, and I've flown all this way. Let's just listen to it 3 times. And we listened to it for the 3rd time. And the director said, yes, you've found the soul of the character. This has everything we need in it. I said, that's great, because that's the very first theme that I sent you. And I'm sure that's happened to every composer, and I don't regret the fact that it went through all of those stages in that process, because actually, in writing the other 6, I really knew what I didn't want to write. And also it sort of expurgated a lot of elements that didn't need to be in there. And by the time I wrote the first theme I'd written again and really produced it properly, it had all sorts of potential to branch into other things. And also at that point, I think there's a lesson in actually going and seeing the whites of people's eyes and watching them listening to something you've written. Because there's 2 ways that music gets received. People hear it or they listen to it. And they will often listen to it if it's focused and in the presence of other people. And I think that's actually what happened in this case. But as I say, I think in coming back round to it, it strengthened the way I probably had produced it and wrote it. And then it became the theme that everything else branched off of. And all 55 music cues that I end up writing within the score, every single one of them has got that 2-note theme in it somewhere. Now, the great thing about writing a theme that's got very few notes in it is you can shove it everywhere. It can hide itself around. And certainly the classical composers would do this, and also the great film composers would do this too, that you have something that's very mobile, can appear in a descant line, a bass line, can appear reversed, inverted. By the time the audience, for instance, in a movie like E.T., by the time you hear the main tune, you've heard it 14 times already, because these short fragments are being buried around in different cues, you know, superimposed or at super low level all the way through. And in game music, it's very important to be motivic. It's very important to have this idea of taking fragments and peppering them through, even reverse engineering them into things that you didn't know needed them earlier. So within the trailer, there's one of the big cues, which was a cue called Dark Knight. Nothing to do with Batman, spelt differently, I promise you, which has lots of these layers. It's got in total, I think, 55 cellos multi-tracked, all in my home studio, and then it's got a 60-piece string orchestra in it as well. But this is still the tune. It's still the main theme, and I thought I'd show you actually the different layers and just talk through what's going on here. Within the trailer, this is the point when they're showing how the narrative could have branched many, many different ways, how it could have actually gone in all sorts of different directions. And in doing that, you need to also hear that the theme can move from being this melancholic, quite internal thing to being actually a triumphant sort of actual payoff moment. So I'll just show you this. This is the point when the character decided to use free will and push through the wall, if you like. So it's now moving into 3 octaves, the actual tune, the whole orchestra backing it up as well, doing descants over it. And there's all this arpeggiation going in as well, which is, again, just the chordal movement, but it's called hocketing, when you move it around all the violin parts. And there's this descant line, which is an inversion of the theme as well here. It's in the full orchestra, and electric cello over the top as well, by the way. That's the very, very top line. Which then comes to kind of big payoff moment, where all the music runs right off the edge of the cliff here. And the little shadow that we're left with is the initial grinding kind of riff and the sort of Victorian theme underneath it as well. I really love in music this sense that you get sort of in cartoons of when a character runs off the edge of the cliff and then they go, oh, where's the ground gone? So you can do that in music really effectively by having a massive wall of sound and then having an instrument just holding whilst the orchestra stops and just doing this thin line that's almost like your hold on to reality. But it also then creates a continuity with the very beginning of the theme as well. I remember first hearing that in the score for Romeo and Juliet by Prokofiev for the ballet, where there are these huge chords going on, this big fight scene, and it keeps breaking and stopping, and then there's this beautiful little chord in a completely unrelated key that's just hanging there like a veil, like a shadow. And it's still something that I use when I'm doing arrangements for rock bands or for EDM groups, that when they have a fall away, when they do this sort of drop and everything comes away, it's lovely just having maybe like a cloud of harmonics or a cluster going on at the same time. So that's what I'm using here as well. And it does that thing where you have a very hard edit in a scene, it gives actually the editor something very clear to work with, where the music's really supporting the picture and hopefully lending a lot of weight to that drop away moment and the relief, the payoff. And the relief is, in this case, in this particular ending, the characters appear to have got away from a situation of extreme peril. It's worth saying that the whole point of the game, as established in this early scene, is that the character that I'm looking after, as it were, Kara, goes from being someone who sort of follows her own programming by rote into actually becoming a mother. So coming back to what I was talking about earlier, my initial instincts for writing music to do with sort of clockwork and machines and broken computers and sound samples was completely and utterly wrong, because the key to her character was to write as if it was affection for a child. It was to be ultra-human, ultra-analog, completely the opposite to what All Sense told me. I found in doing that it was much easier to write, because all I had to do really was tap into feelings about being a parent and then just write very simply in that direction. And of course, I'm not writing for the environment, I'm not writing for the scene, I'm simply writing for the inside of that character's head. It's not a person, it's a character's head. She actually develops this sense of caring for another where, as a machine, she effectively doesn't care for herself. That's really a gift for a composer, because then when someone's playing the game and they're starting to relate, they are feeling, they're doing 90% of the work for you as a composer. Because even if you write something half decent and they are having goosebumps about what they're feeling is going on within the game and their emotional kind of banking within it too, if your music is supporting that in any way, it gives the music a huge amount of weight and importance. And I suppose what I'm trying to say is that many types of music would work with this because actually the drama and the edit and the gameplay is so strong that you become emotionally invested in the characters and the scene regardless of what the music's doing. And in fact, a really good test is in playing this game when I was writing it and having the music turned off, it still felt that way. So all the music can do is either ruin it or improve it. And hopefully if you write on the correct side of your technique, you'll end up doing something that will feel like it means a lot. And in fact, the reaction to this particular piece of music has been quite strong. I think from younger people who've been able to sort of maybe engage with both the characters in the scene and relate to them. And really the music is no big deal. It's what seemed natural to fit. But there's this thing where with any picture that seems to tap into what people feel strongly, the music suddenly becomes important to the viewer. So I thought I'd show you a few very specific techniques that I use when I'm scoring out for an orchestra. Obviously, what you're hearing on the track actually is a lot of demo. It's a lot of stuff that I've recorded at home in a very, very simple setup. When I'm composing, I write in Logic. I use mucked up sounds through an Ableton and a push-to controller. I do a lot of stuff with Spitfire samples whereby, particularly for the ostinato patterns, I'll be using, particularly around violas and violins, I'll be experimenting with patterns until I find something that I like. And then what I tend to do is look at block effects that I can then multi-track using a cello, loop pedals, and then record them in separate lines. So within this cue itself, there's probably about 120 stems going on, half of which are actually done at home just with a cello. And they tend to find that you always think, well, I'll replace those with better players or better sounds. But they tend to stay in because the fragility of the way that they've been recorded sometimes is half of the emotion. And in fact, in recording that particular recording of the theme, it was 3 o'clock in the morning. I'd probably had about 7 coffees through the day and I was really, really tired. And I hadn't been playing a huge amount recently, so my technique was a little bit off in my playing and the way the bow was bouncing on the string was a bit sort of shonky. And it's not perfectly in tune, but I knew I could replace it. But every time I tried replacing it, it didn't sound particularly good. And the reason for that is the frailty and the inabilities in it being in the middle of the night and over-caffeinated and tired and emotional actually really connected with the fragility and the sense of kind of tightrope of the character, which is my excuse way of saying I kept a fairly ropey recording into the very end, but it felt the right thing to do. Now, I thought I'd show you a few different techniques that I've used within the actual scoring for the orchestra. I need glasses because of my age. In this particular cue, there's a long build-up. Now, everyone knows about Sheppard tones, which are this sense of a rising glissando that hands over and hands over and hands over. That really works beautifully in strings. And in fact, what I've done is within this cue, when there's a big build-up to these moments of peril, I've got the whole orchestra just playing separate notes and doing a very, very long drag glissando over 12 bars. It's hard convincing players that you want the glissando to be slow and you don't want to settle on a note. And a really good tip actually for finishing a glissando en masse is that the shape of it could be exponential, a bit like a kind of ski jump. So you do a long drag and then in the very last measure, you actually persuade the players to do both the crescendo and also a fast slide off at the end. And that ends up with this huge lift off. It's again that running off the edge of a cliff thing. And in fact, that's what you hear within that cue. Other things to note in this is when you're putting in a tune over the top, always put octaves over it. You can never go wrong with putting a tune in octaves. Something else that I do in pretty much all the music I write, and it's sort of a habit of mine, is that when you have a bass part written out for double basses or cellos, And here, for instance, where it's quite static, but they are pedal notes, they're strong low notes. Every time I write, for instance, a low D in a double bass, I will always double it almost subliminally with a grand piano sampled at least 2 octaves below it as well. So I've recorded a Steinway at home, and it's simply a repeating slow note. I've then dropped it down 2 octaves, either in Ableton or you can use programs like Iris as well, which does it beautifully. And then taken all the edge off it, actually taken any of the treble elements out of it at all. Now, that doesn't actually give you a defined note. It just gives you this sort of chest lean, if that makes sense. So you hear it when you're in a big IMAX or something, this sense of ultra bass where you feel it and you can't hear it. It's a really good technique I've found to use to stick under any single bass line. It works tremendously well, and it's all throughout this. Some other things I just want to show you in here as well are whenever I've written patterns of 16th notes, of semiquavers running across, always break them between sections with a common handover note. So, for instance, in the trailer theme it's done within the violin parts. The violas will do 3 of the notes, the second violins will do 3 of the notes, but offset by a semiquaver, and then the first violins will pick up and bridge the gap. That's for several reasons. It's both to prevent tiredness in the players, plus these are I've written this in an extremely difficult key for strings. Being a string player myself, I should know better. It just sounded right in C minor. But also, it's to give this sense of space, so that when I'm sitting in orchestra, I will always sit the violas and the cellos in the middle, and the first and the second violins, I'll have them antiphonal one side and the other, which is something that Jeff Foster, the engineer, did, I think, in quite an extreme way on the first Batman score that Danny Elfman wrote. And he showed me the setup that he used in Air Studios for that, and I remember thinking how great it sounded. And that's actually how European orchestras used to sit. But when you're flying semiquavers between the sections, it sounds fantastic if they're then rooted with a viola or a cello in the middle. It gives you all this kind of width in your mix without you having to do anything to the faders at all. So that's also running in there too. I'm very keen to kind of pre-mix whilst I'm recording, to actually have as much of it written into the orchestration as possible, so that you're not giving yourself or your mix engineer these problems with actually having to spatialize everything and try and make things fight. And one more thing on that. I think there's a great parallel in cinema of when you're trying to create depth in a sound picture, and obviously there's 120 lines of instrumentation going on this. There's a danger that it could just sound like mud. And in some of my mixes, it did, particularly before I got the orchestra in there. But actually, the thing to do is think of it in terms of if you're writing music in the sense of it being 3-dimensional. Sometimes, if you go and see a 3D film, it'll be kind of pokey. It'll be kind of at you, in your face, and it'll be quite kind of claggy in the front. Using dimensionality is much more interesting if you use what's called a parallax approach, which is where if you make it that the picture and the sound picture draws you in rather than pokes you in the face. And that's been a real learning curve for me. And in doing that, what you're having to do is you're having to carve out actually blankness. You're having to carve out these spaces. It might mean that when you're recording cellos, you actually have to dip the naturally boomy, resonant parts of their range, of their tessitura. And with a good mix, hopefully it should feel like the listener is actually going to lean forward to hear it rather than sit back because they're being oppressed by it. My route into being a composer, both for film and for games, is actually probably like other people's, follows no conventional path at all. I was a professional cellist for many years, and then a professor of music at the Royal Academy. And then I started really getting obsessed with how music's put together. I wasn't allowed to study composition at the Royal Academy, and I indeed now go back there and do a lecture about why you shouldn't study composition at a music college, which is slightly divisive. But the best way to learn how to write is just do it. It's not how to necessarily going and being overly analytical before you do anything. Certainly be hyper-analytical whilst you are. And I thought it might be useful just to give you a few pointers actually on how to short circuit that process as well. And certainly things that I've learnt through happy experience along the way. In the world of writing game music and certainly music for movies, the really good news is that people who are at the top are really nice, kind, good people. You can't always say that about the classical world. And so for me, moving into that sort of area was great, because also when you do meet the big names, they will tend to be very generous with both their expertise and with their time where possible, and sometimes even with the way that they're generous with the way work is allocated. So the main thing is, when you hear something you like, two things. Ask the person how they did it, and write to them and tell them why you like it. Even now, every day, I will write to either an author or a musician or a composer or a director or an editor, particularly, and say, I saw what you did, I heard what you did, here's what I really loved about it. Believe me, the majority of emails that creative people get tend to be negative. So when you do write to someone and say, I like this because, you will always get a response. And as a composer who has stuck their head above the parapet in some fairly unusual situations, it's lovely to get those messages where someone says, I like this, but I don't know how you did that. You find yourself replying. So some very specific things. In coming into being a musician, being a composer through being a performer, the critical thing was just to work longer, harder than anyone else and do more research. Get up earlier, practice longer, practice harder. That's kind of obvious. And what I always say is that music is generally 90% perspiration, 10% inspiration, and probably 5% accountancy, something like that, I'm not sure. But there's a huge amount of luck within it, and luck is, this is not an original idea, but it's terribly important. Luck is entirely generated. Luck is preparation, meeting an opportunity. That's all it is. You can hyper-prepare, you can get really match fit, you can practice writing music to picture, you can be as genre-wide as possible, but then you can create the opportunities as well. You can actually make things happen. And if you're sitting around waiting for work, just make work for yourself. Be busy. That's very simple. But you need materials to support that as well. And what I wish I'd known earlier is, at all times, carry a notebook. Write stuff down by hand. Don't put it in your phone. Don't put it on a laptop. No great novel has been written with a screen blaring at you. And I'm a great believer that actually great music happens with a pen on paper, because actually the time it takes you to write something by hand, your brain is actually processing the next thought and the next line, whether it's writing music out by hand or whether actually it's writing a business plan or an ambition. And I've always written my ambitions down, in fact, in one of these, it's called a daily journal. And in getting the game, 6 weeks before, I wrote, I'd like to write the music for a small game. Bang, it happened. That's not because it's a magic book. It's simply that you put yourself in a position where your mind set and your frame of mind has moved to that point. Keep a notebook. Secondly, the number of times I've met a composer or a musician and said, where can I hear you? And said, oh, well, maybe I can send you some stuff, or you can go to this website. You've lost me. You've already lost me. It sounds like you're taking time. I always carry a USB drive with my name on it, with my last 5 major scores in it. And do you know what? I can give it to someone and say to them, here's an empty, if you like, USB drive, 4 gigabyte drive. There you go. That's got me probably 5 movies doing that, just having them in your pocket. It's a light way to be quite promotional about yourself. And then the other thing I do is make sure you've got a business card or a calling card with a story behind it that will make people say, wait, what? My particular thing that I do is when I write a project and I finish it, I will often do one of the main cues as a graphic score. I tend to draw my music. It's kind of to do with a short attention span. And I wrote the music for a Star Wars trailer, which was kind of fun because that was on my bucket list, work on Star Wars. And it's an X-Wing fighter, but it's completely playable. And it's also a postcard, so it's not a normal size business card. But you can say to someone, oh, I'm sorry, that's a big card, and they'll look at it, then they'll double take, and they'll double take again. they will then be asking you questions about what you do. And it's kind of a humble brag moment. You can say, well, yeah, that's music that was used for Star Wars. There's another question instantaneously. And it doesn't have to be a biggish thing like that. It can just be something that piques someone's interest. And then when they put it in their pocket and bring it out again, they might tell someone else. But what they won't do is put it in their wallet and then throw it away instantly. They might throw it away later. It's not really the point. Those three things, I think, are really important because what that does is it differentiates you. It gives you material preparation, it gives you creative preparation, and it gives you logistical and administrative organisation. Believe me, those three things are the things that a director, a producer, an editor, a creative wants from any composer. So I hope that helps. It's lovely being here at Spitfire. I love what they do, and I've been certainly the happy beneficiary of lots of their expertise over the years, and I hope you've enjoyed the playing as well.